My brother asked me to babysit his kids for 1 hour but never came back, and now the entire family is calling me heartless for refusing to keep them. I'm 26F and my older brother Garrett is 34M. He has 3 kids, Mason who's 8, Ivy who's 6, and Harper who's 4. His wife Natalie left him about a year and a half ago. She just packed up one day while he was at work and moved to a different state with some guy she'd been seeing. She signed away her parental rights pretty quickly and hasn't been in the kids' lives since. It was brutal for everyone, especially the kids. Garrett's been struggling ever since. He works full-time as a warehouse supervisor and he's been trying to juggle everything on his own. Our parents help when they can, but they both still work and live about 40 minutes away, so it's not like they can be there every day. I've helped out here and there with school pickups or watching the kids for a few hours on weekends, but I have my own life and my own job. I'm not a built-in childcare solution. For context, I work remotely as a graphic designer and I have a pretty packed schedule most weeks. I also have my own apartment and I'm not really set up for kids. No toys, no kid-friendly food in the house, nothing like that. When I do watch Garrett's kids, it's usually planned ahead and I go to his place where all their stuff is. About 3 weeks ago, Garrett called me on a Saturday morning. I was still in bed because I'd been up late finishing a client project. He sounded stressed and said he needed a huge favor. He asked if I could watch the kids for like an hour, maybe 2 max, because he had to run an errand and couldn't bring them with him. He said our parents were visiting our aunt about 2 hours away for the day and he was desperate. I asked what the errand was and he got kind of vague. He just said it was personal and he really needed to handle it alone. I was annoyed because it was my one day to sleep in, but he's my brother and he sounded genuinely stressed, so I said fine. I told him to bring them over and I'd keep them entertained for a couple hours. He showed up at my apartment about 30 minutes later with all 3 kids. They looked tired and Mason was already complaining about being bored. Garrett handed me a backpack with some snacks and said he'd be back by noon. It was 10 a.m. when he left. I remember looking at the clock and thinking 2 hours wasn't that bad. Noon came and went. No call, no text, nothing. I tried calling him around 12:30 and it went straight to voicemail. I texted him asking where he was and got no response. The kids were starting to get restless because I didn't have anything for them to do. I put on some cartoons and gave them the snacks Garrett had packed, but that only lasted so long. By 2 p.m. I was genuinely worried. I called him 4 more times and every call went to voicemail. I texted him again saying this wasn't okay and I needed to know when he was coming back. Nothing. I didn't have Natalie's contact info obviously, and my parents were out with my aunt, so calling them wouldn't help since they were hours away and couldn't do anything anyway. The kids started asking when their dad was coming back and I didn't know what to tell them. Mason was getting anxious and Ivy was upset because she wanted to go home. Harper was the only one who seemed unbothered. She just kept watching TV and eating goldfish crackers. Around 4 p.m., Garrett finally texted me back. All he said was, "Something came up. Can you keep them overnight?" "I'll explain later." I stared at that text for a full minute because I couldn't believe what I was reading. Overnight? He'd said 1 hour, maybe 2, and now he was asking me to keep 3 kids overnight with 0 warning? I called him immediately and this time he actually answered. I asked him what the hell was going on and where he was. He said he couldn't explain right now but he really needed this and he'd come get the kids tomorrow. I told him that wasn't the deal and I wasn't prepared to have them overnight. I didn't have beds for them. I didn't have food they'd actually eat. I had plans for the evening. He got defensive and said plans change and I was his sister and he needed help. I told him I'd already helped by taking them on 0 notice, but this was too much. He said, "So what? You're just going to kick 3 little kids out on the street," which was a completely unfair thing to say. I told him no, I wasn't going to do that, but he needed to come get them or tell me what was actually going on. He said he couldn't come get them and he'd be there tomorrow afternoon. Then he hung up on me. I tried calling back and he didn't answer. I was furious. The kids were still in my living room and I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I didn't want to scare them by telling them their dad wasn't coming back that night, so I just told them we were having a sleepover at my place and we'd make it fun. I ordered pizza for dinner and let them stay up later than they probably should have watching movies. I made makeshift beds on my couch and floor with every blanket and pillow I owned. Mason took the couch. Ivy and Harper shared a pile of blankets on the floor. None of them seemed particularly happy about it, but they eventually fell asleep. The next morning I woke up to Ivy crying because she'd wet the blankets during the night. She was so embarrassed and I felt awful for her. I didn't have any clean sheets or anything to change her into except some of my old oversized t-shirts. I cleaned everything up as best I could and tried to reassure her it was okay, but she was inconsolable for a while. Mason kept asking when their dad was coming and I kept saying soon, even though I had no idea if that was true. Harper was surprisingly chill again. She just asked if we had any cereal, which I didn't. I ended up giving them all toast and some fruit I had in the fridge. Garrett didn't show up that afternoon like he said he would. I called him around 1 p.m. and he answered sounding completely exhausted. He said something had happened and he needed a few more days. I asked him what happened and he said he couldn't talk about it yet. I told him he couldn't just leave his kids with me for days without any explanation and he said, "Your family, I thought you'd understand." I told him understanding had nothing to do with it. This wasn't fair to me or to his kids. He said life isn't fair and he was dealing with something really hard and he just needed some time. Then he said, "Please, just a few more days, I'll make it up to you," and hung up again before I could argue. At that point I was done. I called my parents and when my mom answered I told her everything that had happened. She was shocked and said she had no idea what Garrett was going through. She said they'd come get the kids that evening since they were back home now. I told her I appreciated it because I couldn't keep doing this. I had work, I had my own life, and Garrett had completely blindsided me. She said she understood and that she'd talk to Garrett. She said the kids needed stability and she and my dad would take them until Garrett sorted himself out. My parents picked up the kids that night around 8 p.m. My mom looked upset when she saw the setup I had with blankets all over the floor. She didn't say it was bad, but I could tell she was bothered by it. My dad tried calling Garrett and got no answer. They took the kids back to their place and I was relieved because I'd been running on fumes trying to keep 3 kids fed and entertained while also trying to get work done. 2 days later, Garrett finally resurfaced. He showed up at my parents' house to get the kids. My mom called me right after and told me what happened. Apparently Garrett had gone to meet up with Natalie because she'd reached out saying she wanted to talk about the kids. He drove 5 hours to where she was living because he thought maybe she wanted to work things out or at least be in their lives again. Turns out she just wanted him to sign some paperwork so she could be fully released from any future legal or financial responsibility. She didn't want to see the kids, didn't ask about them, nothing. Garrett said he'd spent the weekend in a hotel room after that meeting just trying to process everything. He said he'd turned his phone off because he couldn't handle talking to anyone. When he finally turned it back on and saw all my messages, he panicked and didn't know what to say, so he just avoided it. My mom said he looked awful when he came to pick up the kids, like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. She said she felt terrible for him but also told him what he did to me wasn't okay. He apparently apologized and said he'd talk to me himself. He called me later that night and tried to explain. He said he was sorry for leaving me in the lurch but he'd been in a really dark place. He said seeing Natalie and realizing she truly didn't care about their kids broke something in him and he just shut down. He said he knew it wasn't fair to me but he didn't know what else to do. He also admitted he'd lied about the errand because he was ashamed to tell anyone he was driving 5 hours to meet his ex-wife who'd abandoned them. He thought if he told the truth, I'd try to talk him out of going. I told him I understood he was going through something awful, but disappearing on me and his kids for days wasn't okay. I said if he'd just been honest from the beginning about where he was going and why, I would have helped him figure something out. But lying and then going no contact was cruel, not just to me, but to Mason, Ivy, and Harper who spent days asking where their dad was. He got quiet and then said, "So you're saying you wouldn't have helped if I'd told you the truth?" I said that wasn't what I meant, but he cut me off and said, "It kind of sounds like it is." Then he said he had to go and hung up. I didn't hear from him for over a week after that. My mom told me he was keeping the kids home from school for a few days and spending time with them. She said he seemed really depressed and she was worried about him. I felt bad, but I also felt like I'd been put in an impossible situation and then made to feel guilty for being upset about it. Then last week, Garrett called me again. He said he needed to ask me something and he hoped I'd say yes. My stomach dropped because I knew it was going to be another favor. He said his work schedule was getting crazy and he needed more consistent help with the kids. He asked if I'd be willing to take them after school 3 days a week and keep them until he got off work around 7 p.m. I said no. I told him I couldn't commit to that. I had my own work and my own schedule and I wasn't equipped to be a part-time caregiver. He said he'd pay me and I said it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that I wasn't in a position to take that on. He said, "So you're just going to let my kids suffer because it's inconvenient for you," which made me so angry I almost hung up. I told him his kids suffering wasn't my fault and it wasn't my responsibility to fix his life. I said I'd helped when I could, but I wasn't going to be guilted into becoming a permanent babysitter. He said, "I can't believe you're being this selfish. These are your niece and nephews." I told him being an aunt didn't mean I had to give up my entire life to raise his kids. He said, "Our parents did it. Why can't you?" And I said our parents chose to have kids. I didn't. He called me heartless and said he'd never ask me for anything again. Then he hung up. Since then, my entire family has been calling me. My mom said I was being too hard on Garrett and he's struggling. My dad said family helps family and I should reconsider. My uncle on my mom's side, who Garrett is close with, called me and said he heard what happened and he couldn't believe I'd turned my back on those kids. His wife called too and gave me this whole lecture about sacrifice. Even some of Garrett's friends have reached out to tell me I'm being selfish. One of them sent me a long message about how hard single parenting is and how Garrett just needs support. I tried to explain my side but everyone just keeps saying, but he's your brother, like that's supposed to erase everything that happened. A few of my own friends have said I'm in the right and that Garrett massively overstepped, but they're not the ones getting calls from my family members telling me I'm a terrible person. One friend said, "You're allowed to have boundaries," which felt validating, but it doesn't change the fact that my entire family thinks I'm heartless. I feel guilty every time I think about Mason, Ivy, and Harper. I love those kids, but I also know that if I say yes to this, it's never going to stop. It'll be 3 days a week, then 5, then overnights, then weekends, then suddenly I'm a full-time parent to kids that aren't mine. About a week after I refused, Garrett posted something on Facebook about how hard it is to be a single parent and how some people will never understand what it's like to sacrifice everything for your kids. A bunch of people commented with supportive messages and a few of them tagged me or made comments that were clearly directed at me. Even though he didn't name me specifically, it felt like a public call-out and it made everything worse. My mom called again yesterday and said Garrett's looking into daycare options but they're expensive and he's barely making ends meet as it is. She said if I could just help out a little bit, it would make a huge difference. I told her I already said no and I wasn't changing my mind. She sighed and said, "I just hope you don't regret this someday." I don't know if I'm making the right choice. Part of me feels like a horrible person for not stepping up. Another part of me knows that what Garrett did was wrong and I can't let myself be guilted into taking on a responsibility I never agreed to. So, am I actually heartless for refusing to keep my brother's kids? Update, 6 weeks later. Things have gotten significantly worse, and I honestly don't know how to feel about any of it anymore. About 3 weeks after I refused to help Garrett with regular babysitting, he stopped talking to me completely, not just short responses or awkward conversations, complete radio silence. My mom told me he was angry and felt betrayed, which I guess I understood even though I still thought I'd made the right choice. Then 2 weeks ago, my mom called me crying. She said Garrett had lost his job. Apparently he'd been late too many times because of kid-related issues, morning drop-off problems, having to leave early for pickups, calling out when one of them was sick. His boss had given him warnings but eventually just let him go. My mom said Garrett was panicking because he had no income and no way to pay rent or take care of the kids. She said he'd applied for unemployment and was looking for new work, but in the meantime he was drowning. She asked again if I'd reconsider helping, even just temporarily until he got back on his feet. I felt awful hearing all of this, but I also knew that me taking the kids a few days a week wouldn't have prevented him from losing his job. The problems he was dealing with were bigger than what I could fix by babysitting. I told my mom I was sorry but my answer hadn't changed. She didn't yell this time, she just went quiet for a long time and then said, "I really hope you can live with yourself," and hung up on me. That was the first time my mom had ever done that, and it honestly broke my heart a little. Less than a week after that, my dad called. He said Garrett had moved back in with them because he couldn't afford his rent anymore. He brought the kids with him and my parents were now essentially full-time caregivers while also both still working. My dad sounded exhausted. He said he wasn't calling to guilt me, he just wanted me to know what was happening. I asked how Garrett was doing emotionally and my dad said not great. He said Garrett barely left the bedroom he was staying in except to be with the kids. He wasn't applying for jobs as actively as he should be, and he seemed completely defeated. My dad said he was worried Garrett was depressed to the point where he might need professional help. I asked if Garrett was seeing anyone, like a therapist, and my dad said no because they couldn't afford it and Garrett refused to ask for more help than he already was. I suggested looking into free or sliding scale counseling and my dad said he'd try to bring it up. Before he hung up, my dad said, "I know you have your reasons, but I think you should come see the kids. They ask about you." That gutted me. I hadn't seen Mason, Ivy, or Harper since the overnight incident, and the idea that they were asking about me made me feel like the worst aunt in the world. I thought about it for a few days and then I drove to my parents' house. I didn't tell anyone I was coming because I didn't want it to turn into a whole thing. I just showed up on a Saturday afternoon. My mom answered the door and she looked so tired. She didn't smile when she saw me. She just stepped aside and let me in. The kids were in the living room watching TV and when they saw me they got so excited. Harper ran over and hugged my legs. Ivy asked if I was staying for dinner. Mason just looked at me and said, "Where have you been?" I didn't know how to answer that. I said I'd been busy with work, which was true but also felt like such a weak excuse. We hung out for a couple hours and I tried to just be present with them, but the whole time I felt this crushing guilt. Garrett came out of the bedroom at one point and we made eye contact. He didn't say anything to me. He just looked at me like I was a stranger, then turned around and went back into the room. My mom saw the whole thing and just shook her head. Before I left, my mom walked me to the door. She said, "You see what's happening here, right? This isn't sustainable. Your dad and I can't do this forever." I told her I knew and I was sorry. She said sorry didn't help anyone and closed the door. I cried the whole drive home. I felt like no matter what I did, I was the bad guy. If I helped, I'd be sacrificing my own life and setting a precedent I couldn't maintain. if I didn't help, I was abandoning my family when they needed me most. Last week, things came to a head. My mom called and said we needed to have a family meeting. She said everyone was going to be there and we needed to figure out a plan for Garrett and the kids. I almost didn't go because I knew it was going to turn into everyone ganging up on me, but I went anyway. When I got to my parents' house, my uncle and his wife were there, the same ones who'd called me before. Garrett was there, my parents obviously, even my grandma had come. The kids were at a neighbor's house so we could talk freely. My mom started by saying the current situation wasn't working. She said she and my dad were exhausted, their health was suffering, and they couldn't keep up with 3 young kids while also working full-time. She said Garrett needed to find a job and get back on his feet, but in the meantime, the family needed to come together to help. Then she looked directly at me and said, "That includes you." I said I'd already explained why I couldn't commit to regular childcare. My uncle's wife cut me off and said, "You work from home, you have the most flexible schedule out of all of us. Why are you acting like you can't help?" I tried to explain that working from home didn't mean I had unlimited free time, that I had deadlines and clients and a career I was trying to build. My uncle said, "Family comes first, careers can wait." I said that was easy for him to say because his kids were grown. Garrett finally spoke up and said, "Just say you don't care about my kids and stop making excuses." I looked at him and said, "That's not fair and you know it." He said, "What's not fair is you sitting in your comfortable apartment living your life while everyone else is here trying to hold mine together." I lost it. I said, "I didn't create this situation. You're the one who drove 5 hours to see Natalie without telling anyone where you were really going. You're the one who turned your phone off and left your kids with me for days. You made choices that got you here and now you're blaming me for not fixing it." The room went completely silent. My grandma said, "That was cruel." My mom said, "How dare you throw that in his face?" Garrett just stared at me with this look that was half hurt, half rage. I stood up and said I couldn't do this. I said I loved all of them but I wasn't going to be guilted into giving up my life. I told Garrett I was sorry he was struggling but I wasn't the solution to his problems. Then I left. No one has called me since, not my parents, not Garrett, no one. I've texted my mom a few times to check in and she's responded with one-word answers. I texted Garrett to apologize for what I said at the meeting and he left me on read. I feel completely cut off from my family now. I don't know if what I said was unforgivable or if they'll eventually come around. I keep replaying that meeting in my head and wondering if I should have just agreed to help. But I also keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd said yes. I'd be taking care of 3 kids multiple days a week indefinitely. My work would suffer. My personal life would disappear. And Garrett still wouldn't have a job or a real plan. I'd just be a temporary patch on a much bigger problem. A friend told me that sometimes doing the right thing still feels terrible. And I think that's where I'm at. I don't feel good about any of this, but I also don't think backing down would have actually helped anyone in the long run. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if my family will ever forgive me. I don't know if Garrett's going to be okay. All I know is that right now, I'm on the outside, and I have no idea how to fix it. Final update, 3 months later. I wasn't planning to update again, but enough has changed that I feel like I should. About 5 weeks after the family meeting blow up, my dad reached out. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just the 2 of us. I was nervous because I thought it might be another attempt to convince me to help, but I agreed. We met at a diner near my apartment and he looked better than he had the last time I'd seen him, less exhausted, a little more like himself. He told me that he and my mom had made some hard decisions. They'd sat Garrett down and told him he had 60 days to find a job and start contributing to the household, or he'd need to find somewhere else to live. My dad said it was one of the hardest conversations he'd ever had, but they couldn't keep supporting him indefinitely while he wasn't even trying. He also said they'd told Garrett he needed to see a therapist, and they'd found a community mental health center that offered sessions on a sliding scale based on income. Garrett had resisted at first, but my mom apparently told him it wasn't optional if he wanted to keep living there. My dad said he wanted to apologize for how the family meeting went. He said things got out of hand and I shouldn't have been attacked like that. He said he didn't agree with everything I'd said, but he understood why I'd drawn a line. He said he and my mom had been so focused on trying to fix Garrett's situation that they hadn't stopped to think about what they were actually asking of me. I cried a little bit when he said that. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged that I wasn't just being selfish. He told me Garrett had gotten a new job about 3 weeks prior. It wasn't as good as his old one. The pay was lower and the hours were worse, but it was something. Garrett was working second shift, which meant my parents still had the kids most afternoons and evenings, but Garrett was at least contributing money toward groceries and helping out on his days off. My dad also said Garrett had been going to therapy for about a month and it seemed to be helping. He wasn't magically better, but he was talking more and engaging with the kids more. He'd even started looking into longer-term housing options so he could move out of my parents' place. I asked if Garrett was still angry with me and my dad paused before saying, "He's working through a lot. I think he knows he wasn't fair to you, but I don't think he's ready to admit it yet." Before we left, my dad said, "You should come by and see the kids again, they miss you, and I think it would be good for everyone." I said I'd think about it. I waited another couple weeks before I actually went. I texted my mom ahead of time to let her know I was coming and she responded with, "Okay, we'll be here," which wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. When I showed up, the kids were so happy to see me again. Harper wouldn't let go of my hand the entire time I was there. Mason told me all about his new teacher. Ivy showed me a drawing she'd made. It felt so normal and so painful at the same time. Garrett was there. He was getting ready to leave for work and we ended up in the kitchen at the same time. It was awkward at first. Neither of us really knew what to say. Finally he said, "Thanks for coming by. The kids really love you." I said I love them too. He nodded and then said, "I'm sorry for what I said at the meeting. I was in a bad place and I took it out on you." I told him I was sorry too for some of the things I'd said. He said, "You weren't totally wrong though. I did make a lot of bad choices. I'm trying to do better now." We didn't hug or have some big reconciliation moment, but it felt like maybe we were starting to move past it. I've been visiting the kids every couple of weeks since then. Garrett and I are civil when we see each other, but we're not close like we used to be. I don't know if we ever will be again. My mom has warmed up a little bit, but there's still this tension between us that wasn't there before. My dad told me last week that Garrett found an apartment and he's planning to move out next month. He'll have the kids back full-time, and he's worked out a schedule with a combination of after-school programs and my parents helping 1 or 2 days a week. He didn't ask me to be part of that schedule, and I didn't offer. I still feel guilty sometimes, especially when I see how tired my parents look, or when one of the kids asks why I don't come over more often, but I also know I made the right choice for myself. I talked to a therapist myself about all of this, just a handful of sessions to work through everything, and she told me something that stuck with me. She said not being able to save someone doesn't make you a bad person, it just means you're human and you have limits. I don't think my family will ever fully understand why I couldn't just step in and help the way they wanted me to, and maybe that's okay. Maybe some relationships change after something like this, and you just have to accept what they become instead of what they were. Garrett's doing better, the kids are okay, my parents are managing, and I'm still here, a little bit on the outside, but okay with the choices I made. It's not a happy ending, it's not tied up neatly, it's just where we all are now, and for better or worse, that's where things stand.